Thank you so much for being here for our second annual Active Aging Summit. I'm really excited to add an additional presenter today, so we have 4, where last year we started with 3. So I hope that you could stay around clear until the end, which will be approximately 12:30 to 12:45. And I know some of you didn't get to go through all of the booths because we're getting started. They will be here throughout the morning, so you can go out at any time, okay? Lastly, if you did not get to sign up for the raffle for either Active Aging or for Blue Cross, don't forget to go out and sign up for that raffle. We will have them in between each presentation, so we'll do one at like 10, and then we'll do one at 11. And so please make sure that you get signed up for that in between the breaks, okay? All right, well, let's go ahead and get started with our first presenter, and I'd like to introduce to you Monique Middlecoff. She has a PhD in exercise physiology from the University of Utah. She's a registered clinical exercise physiologist, a certified strength and conditioning specialist, and is a board certified in lifestyle medicine. Monique is also a published researcher in the field of sport and performance, physical activity, and pelvic floor health. She's recognized as a higher education teaching specialist, and Monique works for a major health system in Idaho. We're so excited to have Monique be our first presenter this morning. Please give her a round of applause.
Thank you so much. Appreciate you. Wonderful. Can you hear me? Good morning, everybody. I'm so glad to be here. I feel like I'm among friends. So if my face isn't familiar to you and we're meeting for the very first time, welcome. I'm so glad to be a part of the Active Aging Summit. And I just also wanted to say thank you to all of the work that Jamie has done to put this together. My love for Jamie is deep and wide. Yeah, Jamie, thank you. Well, today we're going to start off right off the bat talking about exercise. And I am not a morning exerciser, so I just wanted to take a moment to get any of the guilt or the shame right out of the way. There is not, we're not going to be looking back at our past history and evaluating how we've done. We can put that aside. And I just want to start off with some gratitude, because I think we can easily miss the incredible gift of our bodies. And before I jump right into that, let me just quickly make sure, there we go. I wanted to make sure I knew how to use my clicker this morning. But I wanted to give you just maybe a brief connection moment to start off today, because exercise is such an important part of my life, but I really wanted to tell you why this matters to me. So my parents are members of the clergy. They're pastors here in town. And I, in my formative years, had a lot of experience with my parents going to meet with those and sit with those who are in their death and dying stages. And as a really young person, it was incredibly impactful. I got to see those who had beautiful, wonderful lives and wonderful deaths. But I also got to witness the pain and the heartbreak for those who had horrible suffering. And it really was such an impressionable moment for me to recognize that the way we live and the way we die has a lot to do with the behaviors that we choose and just a lot of the lifestyle choices that we make. I played volleyball right here at CSI, and I went on to play at Montana State, so I have this kind of natural love of movement and moving our body, and also being a bit competitive. I really enjoy that too. And then lastly, I really love research, and I find that sometimes research is just a really quick means to an end. It helps us do things more effectively, more efficiently, so that we don't waste our time doing the things that we think might help but actually don't help us in the end. So I'm going to try to weave some of this together today to hopefully talk to you about movement that matters and how we can improve the energy in our body so that we can do more of the things that we want to do together. There we go. Okay. Today, I'm going to ask you, when you see a blue slide that says group participation, this is your time to shine. So when I ask you for some group participation, I want to help you celebrate the things that you're already doing well. So when we get there, I'll let you know. But that's your chance to be able to raise your hand for that particular question. And if you find that you can raise your hand to that question, I just want you to take a moment to celebrate how wonderful it is that you're already doing so many things that help us live wonderful, active lives. But if you find that you can't raise your hand to that thing, that's okay too. It might give us a prompt or something that we can work on for the future. Whoops, I moved on to the slide. Okay, most of us in this room, it's not all of us, but most of us tend to have an energy surplus in the body. What does that mean? It just means that we've got some energy stores in our body, which is a wonderful thing. But do you ever wonder, why doesn't it feel like we have this energy surplus? We might be feeling a bit more tired. Maybe something like, there we go. Maybe something like sluggish or fatigued. It might be maybe some language of feeling a little bit spent or out of capacity, or just flat out weary, sometimes a little bit weary. But we want to talk today about how we can do some physical activity that will help us move from feeling a bit more fatigued to feeling a bit more fresh and revived, to be able to feel energized or vibrant, motivated. Gosh, whew, that's a good feeling. It's a good feeling when we have it. And I think we often have the experience of knowing what it feels like to not have it. We want to feel ready, whether that's ready emotionally or mentally, but also ready physically so that we can do the things that we want to do. Ooh, there's a nice little arrow. Ooh, ah, ooh, ah. Okay, there's 4 big things that I'm going to talk about today. 3 of them that I'm going to talk about briefly, and 1 of them that I'm going to spend some extended time on. So the first thing is sleep. We need to have sleep that's restorative. It doesn't matter how much impressive exercise we do. It doesn't matter how wonderful our diet is, how wonderfully connected we are to others, or any other set of behavior. If our body doesn't have the time that it needs to rest on a regular basis. During exercise, that's the time that we break down those muscles. And during rest and sleep, that's the time that we repair. So if we just break down and break down and break down and break down, the end result is breakdown. But if we're breaking down some of our muscles and then we're resting and repairing, then we get stronger, we get healthier. Our bodies get better endurance. Our bodies get more power, more agility over time, but we have to have that sleep to be able to elicit those responses. Now, movement with a purpose, that's my specialty. That's the part that we're going to spend some time on today. Now, eating is going to be largely covered today by Sarah Rinaldi. It's such a treat that we have her. She's an assistant professor here at CSI, and I know that you're going to love learning from her. And then lastly, it's this piece about caring. Sometimes we think that we can do life alone or that we can succeed by ourselves, but there's no amount of care for ourselves that compensates the amount of care and connection that we have for other people. So we need both parts. We need to be able to care for ourselves, and we also need to be able to care and connect with other people. It actually really impacts our own health when we're able to do that for others. So let's just review some objectives. This is the teacher in me coming out. So for those teachers in the room, I think we can connect maybe over some objectives. So what do we want to cover? We want to talk just briefly about metabolism today. I enjoy talking about metabolism. I won't make this overly complicated, but I think there's some things that we might learn today that could be fun. We'll also talk about the physical activity guidelines so that we all have a clear picture about what it means to succeed with our physical activity. I like to know what's the bare minimum dose. There's some things like in our lives, let's maybe say it's cooking or other things where we want to be like, ooh, A+, just like absolutely nailing it, fantastic. And there's some things where we're like, I need to know what's bare minimum, right? What's the bare minimum cleaning of the house that I can do to get away with it and still not be totally embarrassed? Yeah, we're going to talk about the bare minimum today too. And then we want to talk about practical strategies, real life, real world today strategies to help us meet those guidelines, I want to talk about meaningful tips to engage in strength training. I find that's where most of us tend to struggle a bit. We tend to be pretty good with cardio overall, but strength training tends to get a bit complicated. And the last is my favorite part. Let's review the benefits of exercise together. If we're going to be spending our time doing it, we have to know why it's going to matter to us. Okay, let's start with metabolism. So metabolism is maybe confusing in our culture because people use metabolism a lot to talk about dieting, different types of supplements, but metabolism is actually a pretty simple concept. Essentially, we ingest energy through the food and drink that we have in our day. Whatever beverages we have, whatever food we have is the energy that comes in. And that energy can either be used right here, right now, or it can be stored for later. A lot of us have experience storing it for later. So that energy exchange is called metabolism, and we'll talk about this just a little bit more. So that stored energy, how we store it, we can store it in our muscles and our liver if we're storing like carbohydrates or sugar called glycogen, or we can store it in our fat cells as well. Oh, let me get some water out here just in case. Thank you for just a moment. And yeah, so that can make our body either more efficient or less efficient, just depending on how much we store and how often we're storing it. So if we're storing that energy as muscle mass, that makes our body actually work better for us, right? Now we have a bit more strength to do the things we want to do, to lift and carry and move. But if we store some of that energy as body fat, there's a part of it that we need to sustain health, right? The goal is not to store no body fat, right? It's a double negative, right? We need to store some body fat for it to be healthy in our bodies. But once we start to store too much, then it actually stops being helpful for our bodies. So we need to have a nice balance of energy. But when that energy is used to help repair our bodies, that is a really, really wonderful gift. Now, we all store and use energy in different ways. Every single person in this room is going to have a little bit different way that we store energy, depending on where we store it. And also, pardon me. Ooh, I was worried about this. So sorry. Thank you for that. I've been having really weird cough attacks because of allergies, which is super embarrassing. So thank you for your graciousness while we work through it. But we all store energy a little bit differently. And for those who have maybe something like COPD or heart disease, you might spend more of your energy sources just working on breathing or just circulating your blood. But if we have more of the energy that can be used to do the things we want to do, to get up and be active and go do things, it's going to help us live a more full, active life. So we know if for those who are working on things like sport participation, they might need high energy output. But for a lot of us in our day, we just need to have enough available energy to feel comfortable doing the things that we want to do without having extra limitations. Now, how do we make energy? Can I draw you back to 8th grade biology for just a moment? Do we have any biology teachers in the room? Oh, I was curious. Okay. 8th grade biology, a lot of us learned that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. Now, the powerhouse of the cell isn't the part that we want to spend time on, but we used to see the mitochondria shaped more like a kidney bean or a kidney shape. But can you look at the red on this screen? That's actually a depiction of mitochondria. Oops, pardon me. It is an energy network. It's like a network factory of all of these little factories that can help us make energy or ATP. Now that can be such an important part because it can transform food into usable energy. It's our dominant energy source, and we can get energy in different ways, but our mitochondria can really help us get there. Now, metabolism as a whole is all of them, of the chemical reactions that occur inside of our bodies. All of them. So what does that practically mean? It really just means that it's the grand total of everything we're doing in our day. Whether we're sitting comfortably, we might be chewing gum, we might be breathing, we might be talking to a friend, we might be thinking about what we're doing, we could be digesting food, maybe coffee from this morning. It could be anything that we're doing, maybe wound repair or replacing our blood or replacing muscle cells that have been damaged. All of it is included. Anything. I think I might need a cough drop. I am. Give me 1 second. Thank you, thank you. I'm going to try to make sure that doesn't sound annoying to you. Thank you for your kindness. I could see that was just heading the wrong direction. Okay, so metabolism kind of has 3 components, and it's actually really hard with where you're sitting to be able to read the words, so I'm happy to help you on this one. So we see resting metabolic rate is that large component of our total energy expenditure. What we put out is largely controlled by factors that are just helping us keep our bodies alive, whether that's sitting down, breathing, thinking, digesting, repairing. Most of the energy we actually put out is just keeping our bodies alive. We tend to think about it more like activity energy, which is a really small component. About 10% is just the energy that we give to do activities. There's another small component that is just digesting our food. We call it the thermic effect of food. That makes up the sum total of the energy that we put out. So we know that we have energy that we put in, and then we have energy that we put out. And that large component is controlled just by resting metabolic rate, which controls about 60 to 80% of our overall energy expenditure in the day. We'll get there. I believe. There we go. Okay, if you look at the green and the blue, this is giving us more information about what we can control in our metabolism or that energy output. So if we think about how do we increase the amount of energy that's needed just to control our bodies and keep it alive at rest? Well, if we look at the green, it's telling us that that's something that we have a little bit of control over. And if we look at the blue, it's going to tell us something that we have a lot of control over. And then the items that don't have anything by it, that's going to be something that's non-modifiable, right? Our age and our sex are predetermined, so we aren't able to impact those from a metabolism standpoint. But we do have the ability to impact our genetic traits. That's through epigenetics, right? Our genetic traits, even though they're predetermined, that we have ability to impact them with the foods that we eat, the activity that we do, the movement that we do in our day, and it helps us to have an overall higher energy output. Now, the quickest and easiest way to increase the amount of energy that we put out is 2 ways. The first way is by increasing our exercise. So the more physical activity that we do is going to increase our overall energy output, and also increasing the amount of muscle mass that we have on our body. That is going to be at a higher rate all the time, whether we're sleeping, resting, standing, moving, breathing, anything that we do. If we have more muscle mass on our body, it not only helps us to be physically stronger and able to live independently for a longer period of time, but it also helps us have more energy available every single day because we're using more energy just to keep that on our body. Now, if we have increased exercise, increased strength training and physical activity, that we have more muscle mass gives us more energy. So for those that have been worked on dieting without exercise, it can actually slow down our metabolism over time. And what we're trying to do is the exact opposite of trying to increase our metabolism over time. That's all of the cells in our body working together. Okay, where do we have wise energy investments? Where can we put our energy that's going to give us a high rate of return? Well, I briefly touched on them right at the beginning. We know that investing our energy into having a high quality sleep experience is going to pay off big time, right? So is movement and exercise that has such a great rate of return. Eating high quality foods and eating more meals and less processed snacks pays off as well. And then lastly, caring and connecting with other people and caring for yourself is a really wise investment. Okay, I told you at the beginning that I was going to have 6 questions for you. When we got to a slide that had blue, this is your time to shine. So would you raise your hand for me? If you consistently get 7 to 9 hours of sleep, would you raise your hand? Oh, look all across the room. Ooh! Okay, we've got the home run crowd here, right? We're preaching to the choir on this one. Bravo. Sleep can be really tricky because sometimes if you're really good at it, you could think, oh, why doesn't everybody tackle it so well? I'm just so good at this. But if you really struggle with sleep, this one can be quite the tricky challenge. Now, there are so many benefits of sleep, whether it is improved memory or having a better experience throughout your day with having more energy, better cognition, better recall. But it's easy to say to other people, well, you should get good rest. But practically, that can be very, very hard. And so we know that there's a few things that we can do to set ourselves up for success, to give our bodies the most likely opportunity to be able to have good sleep. Now, the goal, again, is 7 to 9 hours every night, but there are a few practical things that we really can do. Now, with our bodies, there are some things that we can't control. I encourage you to not spend any time worrying about the things you can't control. Those are going to be there regardless. But if we do spend our time and energy focusing on the few things that we can control, often it can make a difference. What are some of those things? Well, sometimes light can wake us up in the night. Just the disturbance of light or having a temperature, whether it's too cold to feel comfortable or too hot, where you're woken up by just that temperature control issues. That can be something that we can work on fixing on purpose. Just the comfort of the pillows that you use, the blankets that you surround yourself with, some of those things with just a little bit more thought and consideration can actually really improve rest. I use something that's kind of embarrassing. My husband calls it a face blanket. There's nothing magical about it. I just like the sensation of having something soft around my face. It helps me sleep well. Whatever your version is of a face blanket, it doesn't matter, but just the things that bring you comfort, that's what we want to spend our time working on. Now, keeping a consistent sleep schedule can also help over time. Making sure that we're not changing the times that we're going to bed and the times that we're waking up on an erratic schedule, that consistency can help lull our bodies into rest. Now, regular exercise is actually something that has been shown across the board to improve sleep. Our physical bodies need to be tired enough to fall asleep. And there's kind of a slippery slope with that. We can either be so tired from exercise that we can't do anything else in our day, or we can find that exercise can be such a wonderful stimulus to help our body sleep deeply and soundly through the night. So those that are regular exercisers consistently have better sleep. Eating meals that are smaller later in the day can help as well, because sometimes in the night, if we're working on digestion, it can be a trigger to wake us up. And also, if we're having to wake up to wake up and go to the bathroom, that can be disruptive. So just limiting some hydration later at night can just be one additional thing that might help. And my last suggestion today is to help manage pain earlier in the evening. We know that if we're experiencing pain, whether it's back pain or hip pain, shoulder pain, or other type of orthopedic pain that will keep you up in the night, if you can work on managing that a little bit earlier in the evening, sometimes that can help you get to sleep and stay asleep. It might be something really simple like sitting with the heating pad in the evening, especially if you're winding down, maybe watching your favorite show or something. Managing pain a little bit earlier can help you have a deeper night of rest. Okay, question number 2, group participation. This is our time. Okay, can you raise your hand if you eat mostly whole food? So that's part 1. Part 2 is in the appropriate quantity based on your physical activity level. Oh, this is the A team. Heaven's sakes, we're in the A team. Okay, I also saw a little bit of a half hand, which might be maybe 1, maybe 2. I'm not quite sure if I fit both parts. Okay, so we know that eating more whole foods is ideal for our bodies. We want to eat food that is alive so that we feel more alive. Sarah is going to go in depth in this, so I don't want to belabor it, just so that we have opportunities to learn from different people. But we know that we want to stay away from eating a diet that's dominant with processed foods, whether that's candy, snacks, processed sweets, or any other large processed foods, and shifting more towards eating meals again with whole food ingredients, things that look like the food that's either grown in the ground or things that we can maybe pick off trees. That's going to help our bodies have more energy, that nutrient-dense foods. So we're looking for foods that have more whole grains, more nuts and seeds, more berries, more leafy greens, and more legumes. They really help our bodies to not only be healthier from a disease perspective, which we want to avoid disease, but we also want that food to help serve as energy. So what we're taking in being transformed into energy that we can use. There we go. Now, does food really matter that much? Well, the answer is a resounding yes. Not just yes, but like a resound with enthusiasm, yes. And I think this one simple thought is just really helpful for me when I think about the types of foods that I want to be eating. And the thought is that the food and drink that we have today, whether it's the coffee that I had this morning or the meal that I had last night or the food I had 2 days ago, it is the only thing that our bodies have to use to replace the cells in our body, to regenerate the muscles, to replace our blood, to replace our cells in our brain, to replace the cells in our bones. That's the only thing it has. They can't grab anything else that we didn't eat or drink. So whatever we eat and drink plays such a big role in the health of our body tomorrow. So if we're eating a lot of things from like cans or just using coffee, because I love coffee, that's one of my favorites. But if we're just using coffee as our dominant food source for the day, tomorrow's body is only going to be built on just that thing. So we have to give ourselves an environment with nutrients that really provide the building blocks to help our body stay healthy. I just have maybe 2 words that might be new to us today, and if not, it might be a fun reminder. But our cells go through a process called apoptosis. Can you say the word apoptosis just for fun? Apoptosis. So apoptosis is the way that cells have a pre-programmed death. So every cell, depending on what type of cell it is, has a lifespan where we anticipate that it will live and it will die and then it will be replaced through typically mitosis. So in that apoptosis, we would anticipate that those cells would move on, and then we excrete them eventually. But we also have a process called autophagy. And autophagy is just the way that the cells will recognize that there's something wrong with a particular cell. That might just be something really simple like damage, whether we scraped up against something and get a little bit of a scuff and we need to clean those cells out. Or it might be something like we've had a cell replicate itself and have a bit of an error in the replication. Our bodies can identify it, kind of seek and destroy style, seek it out, identify that something's wrong, and get rid of it. I don't know how you feel about this. This is wildly encouraging, in my opinion, because it means that we have a few mechanisms for our bodies to get rid of things that are not helping us. It can do that on a regular schedule, right? We have scheduled identification and removal, and we also have this seek and destroy mechanism to help us identify when things have gone wrong to get it out of our bodies, right? That would be really helpful to prevent cancers. So what we eat and what we fuel ourselves with and what we're doing with our activity will help our body be more effective and efficient at identifying errors or damage in those cells and getting them out earlier. So your movement matters, and so does our food. Okay, can you raise your hand if you know the physical activity guidelines? If you were here last year, I think you might know this. Okay, can you raise your hand if you know them? Okay, we've got one. Okay, we've got a few brave souls. It is confusing. Can we just identify, for some reason, in the field of exercise science, we have done a D- job at communicating the physical activity guidelines. D, maybe even an F, in my opinion. This is my field. Like, we should be good at this. We do such a poor job communicating what we need. And just in case this might be new to you, can you help me honestly say this out loud? Because I want to make sure we walk away knowing exactly what they are. Can you say 2.5 plus 2 equals success? Okay, we're going to go over this a few times. That's the whole guidelines, and I'll explain it to you in a lot of detail. That's the whole guidelines. 2.5 plus 2 equals success. That means if we can get 2.5 hours of cardiovascular activity every week and 2 days of strength training or more, we've hit success from a health perspective. I don't know why my community has done a horrific job of describing that to everyone, but for some reason it feels very unclear to me and a lot of people of what does it mean to be successful with our exercise from a health perspective and then also from a longevity and performance perspective. What does that mean? 2.5 plus 2. That's what we want to remember. 2.5 plus 2. Let's talk about it in depth together. Now, I'd always like to preface this by saying, if we can't get to 2.5 plus 2, that's okay, because we want to know any activity is better than none. But I also, maybe it's the teacher in me, I want to know what an A looks like. Don't tell me I'm doing B- work and just call it an A so I feel better. Give me the guidelines so I know what it is. So we do know that any exercise is better than none, but what's the minimum dose? This is what the guidelines look like if you ever went to go look at them. It was released in 2018, so thank God we decided to stick with some guidelines for a while. There was a time there where it changed like every 2 years. Who could keep up with that? That was way too confusing. But we've had the same guidelines since 2018. This is the language that it looks like. I want to simplify this for you just so that you can know practically what that means. Let's look at this in a little bit easier format. So do we see on the blue here how we see 2.5 on the top, 2.5 hours? And then in the green here we see 2 or more days. That's what I mean by 2.5 plus 2. So 2.5 hours of aerobic exercise each week is our goal. We could substitute the word aerobic for cardiovascular here, and it means the exact same thing. So if you have one word that you tend to like better than the other one, use that. It means the same thing in this instance. So we want to get in 2.5 hours over the course of a week. This could be in 10-minute doses of 10 minutes of going on a walk and then doing that again and again to get to a total of 150 minutes. The guidelines are written in minutes, but most of us, I tend to accumulate hours in our mind a little bit easier, which is why I like to say 2.5, but the timing here is 150 minutes. So you can do that in a myriad of ways. You could do that in multiple sessions. You could do that using different intensities, but at least we want it to be at a moderate intensity, where when we're exercising, it feels like we're getting in a little bit of work. Now, the type for aerobic exercise is almost an anything goes, which to me feels encouraging because it means no matter what type of exercise you like to do, it's pretty much going to count under aerobic exercise if it hits just a few simple parameters. And strength training in green, this is where it gets a little bit hard. This is a little bit hard, so we're gonna talk about that a little bit more in depth. But we typically talk about exercise using something like a frequency, which would tell us how often, a time, which would tell us how long, intensity, which would tell us how hard, and then the type would tell us, what are we doing? That's an easy way that we typically talk about exercise. So let's talk about examples of what would fit in our aerobic or what would fit in the cardiovascular. That word means the same. What would fit in that bucket? 2.5 hours. We want to do something like walking, hiking, biking, swimming, jogging, maybe playing sports like pickleball. Does anyone in this room like pickleball? Oh, we've got some pickleball players. I think that's extremely fun. Climbing stairs, dancing, gymnastics works, running works. Anything that has a repetitive component, that's going to help us meet our aerobic guidelines. We'll talk about why this benefits us so much here in a second, but we want to think anything that's repetitive, that's going to allow us to sustain our movement for more than 2 minutes counts for aerobic exercise. Muscle strengthening exercise tends to be a little bit harder to hit because there's so many options. Options sometimes can be wonderful, and options sometimes can make it hard because we don't know where to start. But with our muscle strengthening exercise, we're going to think about something that's a challenge to do, that's going to feel like a challenge inside of our muscles. So this could be using something very traditional, like hand weights or dumbbells. It could be using something like a resistance band or maybe a machine. It also could look like body weight exercises that you might be super familiar with, something like a sit-up or a push-up. That would fit under that body weight exercise. But the goal is that we want to hit all of the major muscle groups. So we're not overly focused on hitting these itty-bitty tiny tendons here and there. We want to focus on what's going to give us, what's going to give us the biggest bang for our buck. We want to go for big muscle groups. That's where we get a lot of improvement. There we go. Okay, now that we know the guidelines, right? 2.5 plus 2. Would you raise your hand if you hit the physical activity guidelines each week? My people, oh my gosh, I love it. That is so encouraging. That is so encouraging to me. So I feel like it's so nice to know, okay, what does it mean to hit the guidelines? Am I doing that? If so, that's a celebration, right? We know that that makes such a difference in disease risk profile, likelihood of independence, and your 10-year mortality. It makes such a big difference, so it's worth celebrating. So if I can give you some encouragement for everyone who raised your hand, say, keep doing that. Keep doing that, keep doing that, keep doing that. Don't let anyone stop you, keep doing that. And if you couldn't raise your hand yet, identify what part am I already having success? Is it the 2.5 piece? Because if so, awesome. Or is it the muscle strengthening piece? If so, awesome. Where am I having success, and what do I need to look at to make sure that I'm hitting that in the future? Okay, bravo to everyone. So for a lot of people, we tend to wait to feel energized before we move. Now, we're talking to the A team here, right? So this is not us. This is not us. This is other people we know. Kidding. Okay, but we often wait to move until we feel energized or motivated. But we actually know it is the movement that we're doing in our body that starts to mobilize our stored energy wherever we have stored it. So it creates us moving before we feel ready. It creates us moving before we feel energized. And once we tend to get moving, we actually start to feel better. Our joints release synovial fluid once we start moving. That mechanical movement that we're doing releases synovial fluid, which is like a WD-40 for the joint. We tend to start feeling at the beginning of movement like, oh, stiff. Oh, maybe this is just me. Like stiff, sore, oh gosh, okay. But once we get moving a little bit, then we think, oh, okay, not so bad. Okay, now I'm feeling a little bit better. But it takes working through that first part. If we wait until we magically feel rejuvenated, we're gonna miss it, right? But there are a few tricks that we can use that can help prompt us that direction in case we're really struggling to get over that hump. One of the things that we can do is to provide outside heat in our body. Outside heat could be something like a hot pack. It could be maybe sitting in a hot bath or a hot tub. That external heat actually helps to provide that synovial fluid release in our joints in a similar way. So if you notice that that feeling of like stiff soreness is really a hindrance to getting moving, and it is for some people, I am definitely there too, use the tools that we have to help our body get in motion. Hop in a hot shower or do something with some extra heat just to help your body get a little bit more blood flow, a little bit more synovial fluid, so then we can start moving and get going. It can help us just a little bit. But the key here is that energy activates our stored energy. So we want to tap into, on purpose, our movement to be able to get that energy in motion. And I find sometimes when we think about exercise, we could think about like, oh, this is gonna take so much time, so much away from the things I wanna do, but I encourage you to choose exercise that adds to your life and doesn't feel like a detraction in some way. Something that you might be able to connect with friends or do movement that brings you joy. Now, a lot of us in this room have had really good experiences with exercise already, that you've already found the type of movement that you enjoy. But I would be naive to think that every single person in this room has already found the type of movement that you enjoy. So if you found it, you have an advantage, bravo, awesome. And if you haven't, I encourage you to keep trying. It doesn't have to be the thing that just, you feel like, oh, I found my place. But to find something that at least at bare minimum is tolerable to be able to do on a regular basis. Okay, so what will this look like? Exercise should look different based on what you enjoy, maybe your history. If you've had a great experience with dance in the past, dance might be the perfect place to start or add. You want to think about what's important to you and important to your family. You want to think about physical limitations, your experience with exercise in the past, priorities, and then practically what is accessible. We want things to be accessible. So I encourage you just to start where you are and use what you have available. Often if we've had an injury or we're working around some type of mobility issue, we can think, oh, as soon as I'm better with that thing, then I'll get back to my exercise. But what we really need to think about is how can I work around that injury to get the rest of my body healthy and whole and improving my fitness so that I can better manage my injury. So if you've had an injury, that doesn't exclude you or disqualify you from being able to do high quality exercise. Now, I talked about this briefly already, but most of us tend to do a pretty good job with cardio. Strength training tends to be harder. I want to show you some slides on purpose just to at least get us thinking about what this looks like. Now, I wrote a guide with the whole intention of just trying to make this more simple because I think it's confusing for a lot of people. Over here, I just listed, if you could see kind of the focus areas. Do you notice how it starts with the top of the body and goes all the way down to the bottom? So we start with the shoulders and then go to biceps, then go to triceps, then go to chest, then go to abdominal, then go to the back, then go to quads and calves, and then go to hamstrings and glutes. For me, it helps me to do things in order so we don't forget things. There is nothing magical about this approach, just so you know. There's nothing magical about it. But sometimes I think it's nice to at least have an idea of what it could look like so we don't get sort of lost in translation. Now, these pictures might be really hard to see from where you are, but I at least wanted you to sort of know what that might look like if we put this in play. So this particular workout just had 8 exercises that we could try to be able to meet that strength training guideline. So we know the 2.5 part, right, of cardio. This is the 2 part, the 2 days a week, working on strengthening for all major muscle groups. That means it might be something that we would want to work on our biceps and our triceps and our chest and our quads. So this exercise selection is just giving us a starting spot of knowing what to do using some hand weights or some resistance bands to work on the strength of our shoulders. Also the same idea to work on the strength of our biceps. Also the same idea to work on the strength of our chest, right? It's just giving us a bit of a demonstration. If you'd like to take a picture of it or ask me for an electronic copy of it, I'm so happy to send it to you. And this same idea is how we could work on the muscles of our core and our abdomen. Same thing with stepping up onto something, working on the strength of our quads and our glutes. Also working on the strength of our back, which can be hard to do at home. And then lastly, working on just that squat position to get our legs nice and strong. Feel free to take pictures if that's helpful for you, but I think sometimes it can be difficult. If we haven't done strength training before, to know how to do that practically and to do it even by yourself at home or at the gym. Now, I think it's kind of like the feeling of how good we are when we brush our teeth with your dominant hand. Do you know what I'm talking about? You know how you can kind of do it mindlessly? I think that feeling of brushing your teeth tends for most people to feel like the two, right? I know how to walk, I know how to ride my bike, I know how to do, all of the things that I enjoy doing for exercise, but this piece over here kind of feels like when you try to brush your teeth with the wrong hand, it just feels weird, like something feels a little bit off, like I don't know the pattern. Am I swirling? What's going on? That, I think, is often what we feel like with strength training. Now, if you've already mastered it and it starts to feel super good over here too, awesome. But I wanted to encourage you, if it happens to feel like brushing your teeth with the wrong hand when you start doing strength training, to keep working through it. You're not alone in that feeling, and it's okay if it feels uncomfortable at first. My encouragement to you is to stick with it, stick with it. Warm up every time. Warm up every time. As we get older, it becomes more important to warm up every single time. Start with some basic movements that just help your body stay in motion. Do some movements that keep your body in motion, and it doesn't have to be a strict prescription or really closely prescribed. You just want to get your body moving and in motion to help prepare your body for exercise. That's so important. Move before you feel ready, and then keep a pattern so that you don't miss a muscle group. We know for strength training, we want to hit at least 2 times a week. I'm paying attention to the time so I don't go over on this one. Okay, how does meeting the physical activity guidelines benefit me? Well, we know that we can make more energy in our mitochondria if we're exercising on a regular basis. We have more factories available in our body, which means we have more usable energy, which I think is a huge home run. I love this picture of the body showing the heart because I like to work with patients who've had heart disease and lung disease. That's what I do for my job. But we know that when we're exercising, we get more blood volume, which means more oxygen available. It's more healing to the rest of our body. Our heart becomes stronger, and our blood vessels are less stiff and less thick, which means that we have more supple blood vessels, lowering our blood pressure, love it, and lowering our resting heart rate. That's such an important thing. Now, in our lungs, we know for those that have issues with our lungs that it can be really difficult by just spending energy on breathing alone. That's a really tough way to spend our energy in the day. When we're exercising, even if it feels hard with our breathing at first, we know that we spend less energy over time because our muscles become better at extracting oxygen so that we have an easier time exchanging oxygen from the blood, from the lungs to the blood to the muscles. Now, our bones become stronger with exercise, become more dense, which means less likely to break and to have fractures. Our bones are also the site of blood formation, so we get so much more blood that's available to us because we have healthier bones that are more dense over time, reducing our risk for osteoporosis, which is wonderful. Now, we don't often think about muscles and diabetes going together, but do we know that our muscles are a storage site for energy. We store glycogen inside of our muscles, and it also helps us to shift our sugars outside of our blood by changing that permeability of the cell during exercise. So we know that when we're able to exercise and do strength training on a regular basis, that our muscles become stronger, more efficient over time, and reduce our risk for diabetes over time. It really makes a difference, and it really improves our independence. Now, I showed this particular image to you last year, but I think it's so helpful to see if we're looking at a cross-section of a quadricep here. The very, very top is looking at a 40-year-old triathlete. The second image is showing a 74-year-old sedentary man, and the bottom picture is showing a 70-year-old triathlete. Isn't it encouraging to see how similar the top and bottom pictures are? They have a 30-year difference between the top and the bottom image. So our bodies are able to sustain so much muscle mass if we keep working over time. And the second we stop moving and decide to not engage in exercise, that tissue that we see from the outside might look similar, but what's happening on the inside could look vastly different. Okay, let's continue. So we know from our brain and our nervous system that we have better short-term memory. We have increased size of that hippocampus so that we're able to maintain long-term storage of memories, that we have clarity of thought and faster recall when we're exercising consistently. We also know that we tend to have lower stress and lower anxiety if we have a healthy mechanism to release that stress every day. I am a nicer, kinder, better person when I exercise than when I don't consistently. It helps our brain. We actually do better with physical activity. And I think one thing that's encouraging as we age is that we have reduced risk of cognitive disease like Alzheimer's and dementia when we're consistently exercising. Ooh. Okay, lymphatic system. Do you know we don't see images of the lymphatic system very often? Which I just think is kind of interesting. We see lots of hearts and lungs in our images, but we don't often see the lymphatic system. So I just wanted to quickly show you. It's depicted here in green, just so you can get an idea of what it looks like. But we know that exercise improves our immune function. And one of the main ways it does that is because there is no pump that circulates our lymphatic fluid. Just like we have with our blood, our heart is the pump. If we're just sitting down, it's pumping. But our lymph system isn't pumping if we're not moving. It pushes up when we put force into the floor, if we're standing up on our tiptoes, if we're squeezing the muscles of our legs, it pushes the lymph through that one-way valve, and it helps it eventually dump back into our heart so that we can clean and move our lymphatic system. If we're not moving, it's not moving. So the movement that you do really helps improve the circulation of the lymphatic system and gives you overall a healthier immune system over time. And it also drives down the inflammation that tends to be so difficult. Okay, last thing I want to spend a moment on. Can you raise your hand if you spend 30 minutes or more thoughtfully caring for other people this week? Oh man, A-team, oh, I love it. Can I ask this question one different way too? Have you spent 30 minutes or more caring for yourself this week? Oh, nice, okay. Fewer hands overall. Okay, can I use like my parental eyes for a moment? Do you know like the parent eyes? It is so important to care for others and also to care for yourself. If your compassion only includes others and does not include yourself, it is incomplete. And so many times we can be such good caretakers for other people that mama bear instinct to care for others can kick in. And sometimes we can forget about how important it is to put that mask on your mouth first before putting it on someone else to make sure that you are able to have enough energy to care for other people too. So the connection piece is so important in our overall health that caring and connecting together really does make a difference. The neglect that can happen over time with aging, the neglect for our fitness, the neglect for our cardiovascular or pulmonary health, the neglect for caring for just the way that we are with our own hygiene can so negatively impact our health that I really give you so much encouragement today to spend time caring for those around you and caring for yourself. It makes a huge difference. Isolation equals low energy over time. Now, I'm just going to skip forward to 3 slides here because we are right at time. If you would like me to go back and to give you some examples, I do have 3 examples that I'm happy to share. I'm going to move forward just to get to the point where we have, whoop, there we go. There's some resources. Let me get to it. I'm so sorry. There we go. If you want to connect with me later, feel free to send me an email or give me a call. If you'd like some additional resources, I just ran out of time to be able to talk with them in more detail. But I wanted to thank you for having me today. Thank you for spending your time working on your health. It's such a pleasure to be here. Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Jamie, and then we will turn the presentation over to Dr. Sammy Aschenbrenner, and you are going to love her. She's a dream.
Okay, thank you so much, Monique. Isn't she just fabulous? Her energy, wow. So I wanted to give this little gift to Monique for her time and her energy today. So thank you so much. If you have questions, Monique will be actually out in the lobby. If you would like to go out and stretch your legs for just a minute, we'll have about an 8-minute little turnover until we can get our next presenter, Sammy, up. So if you have additional questions, please go catch Monique out in the lobby. Thank you.
Hello, testing. Testing, testing. Thank you.
All right, everyone. Hey, welcome back. We're going to do the raffle. I'm going to have Carla here pick out a name for us. Okay. Oh. Our first winner is
Frank Ellis.
Frank Ellis. Come and get your prize.
If he belongs to you, we'll let you collect it.
Congratulations, Frank. We will do another raffle again after Sammy's presentation. Everybody's starting to wander in. I'd like to introduce our next presenter. This is Sammy Aschenbrenner, and she's a doctor of physical therapy who is passionate about empowering community members to improve quality of life through movement, education, and exercise. She specializes in orthopedic and pelvic health physical therapy. She was inspired to work in this extremely underserved area of pelvic, wow, that's a hard word. How do you say that so many times? Healthcare while in graduate school, seeing the intense need to increase awareness and improve care for people with pelvic floor dysfunction. She is certified pregnancy and postpartum corrective exercise specialist, certified yoga and prenatal yoga instructor, and has extensive postdoctorate training in manual therapy, including visceral manipulation, the fascial distortion model, and functional dry needling. Outside of being a clinic owner at CPR Physical Therapy, she loves yoga, spending time outdoors, skiing, and running all distances. Having participated in 5Ks up to 50-mile ultra marathon, wow! She is thrilled to be living with her beautiful family in her hometown of Twin Falls. Please welcome Sammy.
So much. Thank you. Maybe a mouthful there. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. I feel so honored to be here and speaking today at this Active Aging Summit. If some of you were here last year, my colleague Julie Ellis was a speaker, and she briefly mentioned pelvic health physical therapy, and I think that is what got the ball rolling to get me invited here today. So super honored to be here and speaking. And I want to thank Jamie so much for putting this together and asking me to be here. So give her another round of applause. Thank you, Jamie. So like mentioned in that bio, my name is Sammy Aschenbrenner, and I'm a doctor of physical therapy here locally at CPR Physical Therapy and Performance. And I like to work, one of my areas of specialty is pelvic health physical therapy. And that brings me to the title of this presentation, A Paradigm Shift, Normalizing Pelvic Floor Treatment for Optimal Aging. Okay, so I know when I say pelvic health physical therapy, that may make some of you cringe a little bit in your seat or may make you feel a little uncomfortable. Some of you may have come to see Monique, her wonderful presentation that was earlier, and you're like, I really want to see Sarah later in the day. I guess I'll sit through this pelvic floor physical therapy speech, but I'm so happy to have you all here. This is something that's very important to all of us. Pelvic health is something that we could all learn a little bit more about to improve our health and our aging. So I feel really honored to be here to educate you. I really believe that step one of improving our health is knowing what is going on with our pelvic health and knowing that there are options for treatment to help improve this. So don't worry, we're all in this together. So the reason I do want to bring this up, let's talk a little bit about prevalence of pelvic floor dysfunction. We'll get into what that means a little bit further down the road. But prevalence of pelvic floor dysfunction, it's very common in our society. In women, tends to be, as we age, up to 69% of the population deal with some sort of pelvic floor dysfunction. So if you look in this room around, that's more than half of the people sitting here may be dealing with something in pelvic floor dysfunction. Men, it's a little bit lower number, but all you men out there, I don't want you to feel left out. There's also some pelvic floor dysfunction that is prevalent in male. They estimate up to 1 in 6 males have something that is a pelvic floor dysfunction that they could improve upon. So here, the reason I want to educate you and talk to you about this is we know that our society, our healthcare system tends to be more of a reactive society. So after we've been dealing with something for a long period of time, that is when we may start to seek treatment. The longer we've had an ailment, the longer it takes for our body to improve and heal and recover from that. So if we can start working a little bit on the preventative side, if we can educate ourselves, know a little bit more about treatment options, that can be very helpful at moving us more to that proactive or that preventative side rather than always responding reactively. So I love this quote, 1 ounce of prevention is worth 1 pound of cure. Okay, so let's get into some of the details here, some of the exciting stuff. What is the pelvic floor? You may hear me saying that and you may think, what is that? What does that include? Or you may be a total pro. You may already know what this is. But just to go over that so we're all on the same page, the pelvic floor is a muscle group that rests at the bowl of our pelvis. So these muscles contract and relax just like any other muscle in the body. They're here to support all of our internal organs as well as help with many other functions. But you can imagine the base of this bowl is a big muscle group. That would be what rests in the bowl of our pelvis. So who has a pelvic floor? I mentioned that men, you're not going to be left out here, but all humans, both sexes, have pelvic floor muscles. And I put up this slide so that you can see the top model here is a female pelvis with the pelvic floor musculature. The bottom is a male pelvis with the pelvic floor musculature. So you can see when we take away those internal and external genitalia, the musculature is almost identical, exactly the same. So that is why we can work on these muscle groups and for both the female and the male population. Okay, the pelvic floor in our body. This model is an anatomical model of a female, but I want you to see how the very bottom of that model is the pelvic floor musculature. It runs from the pubic bone in the front of the body to the tailbone in the back of the body. These muscles attach to the bones of our pelvis to help stabilize our spine and to help support those organs like we mentioned. So here you can see a model. These pelvic floor muscles are basically like a hammock or a sling to help hold everything within our body. This is our only transverse muscle group, meaning muscle group that runs in this direction to help lift and support everything. And then our pelvic floor muscles work as a team with some of those other core muscles in our body. So they work with the muscles of our spine called our multifidi. They work with the deepest layer of our core, our transverse abdominis, and it works with our diaphragm muscle that helps with respiration, pulling in and air in and out of our lungs. And like I mentioned before, the pelvic floor is skeletal muscle just like any other muscle in the body. So it can contract, we can actively contract it. It can relax, it can have too much stiffness, it can have too much laxity, so it can function like anything else. But for us, we all kind of know contractions in other parts of our body. We know what it feels like to contract our bicep and flex that muscle. A lot of us maybe don't know what it really means to contract our pelvic floor muscles or if that is what we should be doing. So we'll get into that a little bit later. But I wanted to first connect with some breath. The pelvic floor is totally intertwined with our breathing. And I wanted to give you a few tools that you can use for home on your own. And I wanted to start a bit with diaphragmatic breathing. So the reason I talk about this with the pelvic floor is that our diaphragm moves in tandem with that pelvic floor musculature. The first picture is inhalation. As we inhale and pull air into our lungs, our diaphragm descends into our trunk cavity. It moves downward. And the same thing happens for our pelvic floor. Our pelvic floor mirrors it, moving down, actually relaxing and lengthening a bit. And then as we exhale, that diaphragm moves back up as the air moves out of our lungs, and our pelvic floor mirrors it, doing the same thing. That is when we actually have a contraction. So if we are trying to tie our pelvic floor to diaphragmatic breathing, we actually want to think of contracting the pelvic floor on that exhale as everything is lifting. And so getting a little bit more into that diaphragmatic breathing, I like to just help educate people and know, how do I do a proper diaphragmatic breath? We hear that term a lot, but we may not know exactly what that means. So a diaphragmatic breath, we want to imagine that we are moving our rib cage all the way around, 360 degrees around our body. As we inhale, we should feel like our rib cage is moving in all of those directions and expanding, or another term for it is an umbrella breath, like we are feeling our rib cage move all directions. Sometimes when we breathe, we kind of cheat, use just our belly, or we cheat using just these muscles called an accessory muscle breath, where we do really short and shallow breaths. So if we really want to kick in and get the most bang for our buck, we want to have that nice 360-degree breath. So diaphragmatic breathing, it reduces blood pressure within the body, or these are things that can help with practice of diaphragmatic breathing. It can enhance cardiac and pulmonary function. So Monique probably loves diaphragmatic breathing. Improves cardiorespiratory fitness and respiratory muscle strength, and can help to reduce stress, anxiety, and depression. And the reason I bring this up, we're going to dive into this a bit more, but there's a lot of correlation between stress within our body and what's going on in our pelvic floor musculature. So here's where we will start. Diaphragmatic breathing. Now you have a good idea of how to do that properly. So common pelvic floor dysfunction symptoms. We mentioned pelvic floor dysfunction and the prevalence of it, but you may be asking yourself, what does that really mean? So pelvic floor dysfunction can be a wide array of symptoms, and these are some of the most common ones, but it can be pain located in the pelvis, the groin, the low back, or the hips. It can be urinary or fecal incontinence, which is leakage. There's two different parts of that urinary incontinence. Urge incontinence means leakage when we feel that urge, but we can't quite make it to the restroom. And stress incontinence is when we have an increase in some sort of force, such as coughing, sneezing, exercise, jumping, lifting, movement, those type of things that can trigger some of that incontinence. We may experience incomplete bladder emptying, weak urinary stream, chronic constipation or pain with bowel movements, pain or difficulty with intercourse, pelvic pain, pelvic pressure, or pelvic organ prolapse. So that's when some of those internal organs are not supported the way they're supposed to, and they start actually wanting to protrude from the body wherever they are able to do that. Okay, so what is pelvic health physical therapy? I would love to know, by a raise of hands, if you have heard about pelvic health physical therapy before. Did you know that this is a realm of physical therapy? There's a few hands. Great, but not everyone here. So this is step one and why I'm here to help people out, so that we know that there is an option to help with pelvic floor dysfunction. So we are just a specialty of PT working on integrating that pelvic floor motor control training into rehab so that we are able to improve our quality of life. So pelvic floor dysfunction can really play a big limiting factor in integration into society. If we think about, having that fear of having some sort of perhaps incontinence out in the community, that can limit us from going places or staying places certain durations. It can limit our social engagement and interaction, and it can actually decrease that quality of life score. We know that people that have higher ratings of pelvic floor dysfunction tend to have a little bit lower score on that quality of life rating. So our goal is to improve our function in the pelvic realm so that we can also hopefully help improve that quality of life score. So these are going to seem very similar to the symptoms, but these are some of the areas that pelvic floor physical therapy can be super successful in helping. So pelvic pain, pain with intercourse activity, voiding, having bowel movements, any sort of pain in that pelvic region. Urinary dysfunction, like we mentioned, having some of that incontinence, that leakage, that urgency, or that ability or that inability to fully empty the bladder. Those people who feel like they void, they stand up, they move around, and they have to go again in a couple of minutes. Painful bladder symptoms, so if there's any pain at all with voiding or emptying the bladder. Bowel dysfunction, constipation, any of that fecal or flatulence, incontinence. We can work on those lumbar, sacral, so low back and hip dysfunction, back pain, SI joint dysfunction, coccydynia, which is tailbone pain, so pain at that tailbone with prolonged seated positions. Also, you saw that I really like to work with the pregnancy and postpartum population. So we can do things like work on the separation of the abdominals. That can happen with pregnancy, can also happen just with weight gain and time. And so we can help correct that. We can work on post-cesarean scar tissue mobilization. But we can also, outside of that, work on any scar tissue mobilization. If you've had any abdominal surgery, anything that has scar tissue in that region, we can actually help to mobilize, making sure that everything within that pelvic cavity is not getting adhered or glued. That's something called visceral manipulation, and something that I'm trained in, where we make sure all of those internal organs are able to move and not be adhered to one another. Pelvic floor recovery postpartum, and pediatric pelvic floor dysfunction. So this may not pertain to you, but if you have people in your life that have children and they have gone beyond that normal range of age for potty training and they're still having difficulty with bowel and bladder control, I get to work with that pediatric population as well and really love that. Okay, some of the factors. Why do some people have pelvic floor dysfunction while others do not? There are some factors that we know play into this, such as pregnancy, and the more consecutive pregnancies or the higher amount of pregnancies, the more that can play into it. Childbirth, prostate cancer treatment, abdominal or lumbopelvic surgery, so any surgery in that lower quadrant region. Obesity can play into the amount of stress that's playing or resting on that pelvic floor that the pelvic floor has to work against. Chronic straining during bowel movements, a lot of bearing down and putting force and pressure into that region can play into some of that dysfunction as well. And sarcopenia, which we'll get into a little bit more. But that is changes in muscle mass due to aging that happen naturally over time. Monique Middlecoff gave a wonderful depiction and explanation of how staying active, working on resistance training as well as cardiovascular training can really help limit that amount of muscle mass that we lose over time. But we know that can play into what's happening here. And people that have more weakness or spend more time in a sedentary position, in seated position, as they lose muscle mass throughout their entire body, they're also losing some of that muscle mass in the pelvic floor. So one interesting thing about the pelvic floor is there can be two categories that it can fall into outside of that normal pelvic floor function. So one side of that is that we can have too much pelvic floor weakness. That category, there's too much laxity, there's not enough support. But on the other side of the coin, we can actually have too much stiffness and tightness, and that can limit the ability for the pelvic floor to function. If things are stiff and tight and shortened, when the pelvic floor needs to be contracting to support those internal organs, those muscles are unable to perform that job and show dysfunctional symptoms as well. So we will talk a bit about those different realms of pelvic floor dysfunction. If I can get this to go. Okay, symptoms of pelvic floor weakness. So again, going over some of these categories that we've seen, but we tend to see with weakness more of that incontinence, more of that leakage with activity. We see that with urinary and fecal incontinence. We can see more of that organ prolapse. People can feel pressure throughout their whole pelvis. Or they'll get more of that low back, hip, and pelvic pain or instability because these muscle groups aren't working at that region to work with the core to support and stabilize this whole region. That sarcopenia that we mentioned, there's a reduction in muscle mass and strength which occurs naturally over time. It begins occurring in that 4th generation of life and on. So it started when we were in the 40s, in our 40s, and continued past then. And that's when we really need to step up that exercise, that resistance training. 30 to 50% decrease in skeletal muscle mass by the age of 80 if we're not actively working on it and being proactive in our health there. And that we know that weakness is worsened by the unloading of muscles. So that means things where we are not adding resistance to our challenge or we're spending more time in a seated position. So now going to the other end of the coin, symptoms of pelvic floor hypertonicity. So the hypertonicity is that stiffness. And you can see that there's a lot of overlap between these two areas of pelvic floor dysfunction. And so that is why it's really helpful to see someone who is a specialist in this region. Sometimes we don't know exactly what is going on in our body with our pelvic floor dysfunction. So we may try to do something like talk to Dr. Google, just Google it online, right? And doing that, we may have a slew of exercises come up. Hey, try this, try this. But sometimes, if, for instance, we already have too much pelvic floor tension and tightness in a region, and then we're just doing contractions on top of that over and over and over again, it's going to amplify that dysfunction. So our goal in pelvic floor physical therapy is to really figure out what is going on in your body individually, and then where do we need to focus our efforts to make this most successful. So with that hypertonicity, that tension, we again may see some of that urge and stress incontinence, so that's a common one here. This end of the spectrum is where we see more of that difficulty with incomplete bladder emptying or difficulty initiating that urinary stream. We may see more constipation because our pelvic floor is not relaxing to allow the passage of that stool. We may have more pelvic pain, such as pain with intercourse or with those bowel movements. And we may have more of that tailbone pain because those tightened muscles are basically pulling on that tailbone or pulling it forward for prolonged periods of time. So I just wanted to highlight a little bit about endometriosis. This is a health condition where the normal lining of the uterus starts to grow outside of that uterine wall in the pelvic cavity. And the reason I brought this up is it's very common in women. It can affect 1 in 10 women. And it starts in the teens and the early 20 years. So it's in these very formative years in development. But on average, it can take up to 10 years for someone to be diagnosed. And so in our healthcare system, typically people who have endometriosis are having a lot of pain throughout the region. And they may be seeing multiple providers. One research article said often up to 7 providers before they are actually diagnosed. And so this is one area, again, where this population is very underserved. They may not know where to go or who to talk to about this. And physical therapy is not going to be the only cure-all for endometriosis. But what physical therapy can do is help people manage symptoms of pain. So anytime that there's pain pertaining to this whole region, our goal is to help minimize that pain to, again, improve function and quality of life. This is just one example of a painful condition that can result in tension throughout the body. This is why I bring this up. Now, going on and diving into that a little bit deeper, there's a big correlation between stress and pelvic floor dysfunction. And it tends to be in that second category with pelvic floor tightness or hypertonicity. So we know there's a big correlation in the body between our mind and then our physical tension that we see in muscles and muscle groups. So depression, anxiety, and sleep disorders are correlated to pelvic floor tension. If we are experiencing that, we tend to see more of that tightness resting in certain regions in the body, the pelvic floor being one of these regions. When stressed, our body responds via the HPA, which is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And this triggers a response of stress hormones in our body, such as cortisol, epinephrine, and norepinephrine. With that epinephrine and that norepinephrine, epinephrine is also known as adrenaline. So many of you have heard of this. And these stress hormones work together in the body to increase blood flow and cause our muscles to go into that fight or flight response, prepping us ready to run, whatever it is. But these stress hormones, although they do leave the body relatively quickly after they are initiated, they may stay if there's a constant pressure stress trigger. And as those stress hormones stay in our body for longer periods of time, we tend to start holding that tension in muscle groups within our bodies in different regions, one being the pelvic floor. We'll talk about some of the other ones as well. Cortisol is the other one we mentioned, and this is another stress hormone. This one stays present in our body for hours after that stress trigger has occurred. And this chronic stress can lead to muscle tension, exhaustion, pain, poor sleep, and lower immunity. That physical pelvic floor dysfunction often needs to be addressed in something more holistically. So we can do a little bit in terms of working on that physical side in physical therapy, and we do a lot to help improve some of that stress and tension with tools like breathing, mindful practiceness, relaxation practices. But we know that there is so much overlap that we have to work on, not only that mind, but that body as well. Places of tension and stress in the body. We tend to hold on to that tension in our muscle groups of the pelvic floor, as well as those glutes, also the upper trap. So maybe some of you have noticed, oh, my neck really feels that tension when I'm stressed. Super common. And then the jaw. So there's a huge correlation between pelvic floor and jaw tension. A lot of people that I see that are coming in with some of that chronic tension throughout the pelvic floor are dealing with a lot of jaw issues, like perhaps TMJ or something where they're having tension throughout that front of the body and the neck as well. We could really dive into this. There's a lot of correlation that goes all the way back to embryonic development. Day 15, the neural tube as we're developing. One end of the neural tube is the mouth. The other end is the end of our digestive tract. So they start forming together and separate. But the most important thing for us to recognize is, hey, maybe if you notice you do have some of that tension throughout neck and jaw, you may have something similar going on throughout that pelvic floor region. So we know there are great ways to reduce stress levels. And so step one is some of that deep abdominal breathing, which we talked about at the beginning of this class or this lecture. There's also good research on focusing on a soothing word, such as peace or calm. Visualization of tranquil scenes can help with some of that stress. Repetitive prayer, yoga, or Tai Chi. So some of these things, how many of you have some sort of practice like this that you perform on a regular basis? Yoga, meditation, look at that. You guys are so impressive, and I encourage you to keep doing that. And if you do not have some of this, see, where can you fit that into your schedule? Can you make it a daily thing? Maybe it's 5 minutes a day when you first wake in the morning. Maybe it's 5 minutes before you go to bed at night to help kind of calm that system, relax that body. I'm going to give you one other tool to practice this at home. So there's something called a square breath. Now we know how to do those nice big diaphragmatic breaths where we're opening up the rib cage in all directions. But a square breath is something where we actually inhale for the count of 4. We hold that full lung for a count of 4. We exhale for a count of 4. And then we hold that breath out of the lung for a count of 4. And we just repeat this, imagining that you're kind of going through this square-like pattern of a breath. So I encourage you all to try that if you feel comfortable here. One breath. So start by exhaling all the air from your lungs. And then we'll do a nice slow inhale for the count of 4, 3, 2, 1. Hold at the top, 4, 3, 2, 1. Exhale, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hold at that bottom, 4, 3, 2, 1. Good. So there's great research on how this can help to calm that nervous system, that fight or flight response that we talk about. Sometimes we don't know we're resting in that fight or flight response, but doing some sort of breath like this can help to calm things back down and hopefully help minimize some of those stress hormones that can be happening in our body. Okay, so we talked about this at the beginning. I had you have a show of hands, but do you know about pelvic health physical therapy? As you raised your hand, there were definitely some people in the audience that did, but a lot of people who didn't. So I like to say that it's more than just the Kegels. Maybe some of you have heard of a Kegel exercise. Has anyone heard of that? And that's what they have termed those pelvic floor contractions. But sometimes people think, oh, I don't want to go into therapy. We're just going to do those Kegels the whole time. I don't want to do that. And I can understand, but there's so much more beyond that Kegels. So first, we are going to work on, if you come into physical therapy, understanding how do we do a proper pelvic floor contraction? Where is that pelvic floor? What should we be feeling when we're doing a contraction? We know one of the best cues is just contracting or engaging those muscles like we're stopping the flow of urine and the passage of gas. That's a great way to cue that. But beyond that, we are going to work on some other things like pressure management within the body. We saw how all those muscles work around the trunk, the spine, the pelvic floor, and the diaphragm. And our goal is to manage the pressure so that we're not getting too much pressure bearing down throughout that pelvic floor and causing dysfunction on the muscle groups. We're going to locate areas of muscle imbalance throughout the entire body to work on improved function. So that's a little perk. Not only are you going to work on the pelvic floor, but you get to kind of see the whole body, how it all works together, and how can we improve. We're going to work on changing some poor bowel and bladder habits. We'll talk a little bit about that here at the end of the session. And we'll also incorporate pelvic floor into exercise, movement, functional activity, things to help with activities of daily living. This is a rhetorical question, but do you think you know some friends and family that would benefit from pelvic health PT? So I'm a little biased, but I think anyone with a pelvic floor would benefit from pelvic floor PT. And one of the biggest steps here, like you saw when we came in today, some of you knew about this, but some of you did not know about this. And I think the biggest step that we can do to help our community be more healthy is if you know someone maybe who's struggling with this, you have family members who may benefit from this, maybe we can break down some of those barriers of limiting us from talking about pelvic floor dysfunction. Maybe we can talk to them a little bit about some options that are out there for them. So why don't more people know about pelvic health PT? I wanted to get into a little bit of the barriers of treatment. But we know that sometimes there are cultural or generational beliefs that discussion of the pelvic floor is a little bit taboo. So we do want to break down some of those walls that are limiting us here. We want to know that this is a muscle group in our body, just like any other muscle group in the body, that it works to function to support our activity and our quality of life. You know, you think about it, we wouldn't have any trouble talking about this group of muscles in my shoulder, the rotator cuff, isn't working the way it should. Maybe I should go get treatment for it. but we often have some difficulty saying, hey, my pelvic floor is not working the way it should. I want to go see treatment. There may be a belief that the pelvic floor dysfunction is normal. So this I could go on and on about, but maybe some of you have had the experience in the past where you've talked to someone about it, you've talked to a provider, a healthcare provider about it, and people have said something like, oh, you're aging, that's just part of aging. Or, oh, you've had kids, that's just part of having kids, you're never gonna be the same again, right? Or sometimes we joke about it, we kind of normalize it. We say, oh, after you have kids, you're never gonna be able to jump on that trampoline again, you're gonna have a little leakage, right? And the more we kind of normalize that dysfunction, the more that we limit people's ability to know that there are treatment options out there. Another barrier to treatment is insurance non-coverage. Of course, that can be a limiting factor, but I always like to tell people that if your insurance covers physical therapy, pelvic health will be included in that physical therapy coverage. There may be a lack of awareness about pelvic floor treatment. We're working on that here today. There may be a negative perception regarding the benefit of pelvic floor PT. Some people might think, I don't think that's really going to change much for me. I don't think I need that. There may be a lack of self-discipline owing to both intrinsic and extrinsic factors. So it may be hard to get yourself to that first appointment, right? Or to continue with the exercises. But for you, we know that if we can really prioritize your health, yourself, taking care of yourself 30 minutes a week, like Monique mentioned, that can be a great step to improve our quality of life over time, over our lifespan. There may be a lack of confidence on how to perform pelvic floor exercises properly. That's why you come into pelvic health physical therapy. Will help you understand and know how to do that. Or there may be skepticism regarding the efficacy of the treatment. So those are some of the barriers that I hope we are educating you and changing your thoughts maybe of some of these barriers. Okay, pelvic floor treatment. As a physical therapist, when someone's coming in to work with me on their knee, people are comfortable, no problem, this is an easy thing. But sometimes when people come into pelvic floor physical therapy, they may be a little more hesitant. They may be worried, what is this going to include? What does this entail? So I wanted to give you a little brief overview of what it may look like if you come into physical therapy for that first visit or subsequent visits. Initially, when you come in, we'll just talk about what's going on with you and with your body. We'll understand what are some of those symptoms that you're experiencing, and can we start to categorize you? Where do you fall on this dysfunctional level? What end of the spectrum? Then we'll do some objective assessment where we're looking at strength, range of motion throughout the entire body. We can look at things like, how is your hip moving? What is the range of motion of your hips? If your hips are limited in one side versus the other, or if your back movement is limited in one side versus the other, it may give us some clues of you may have tension in one side of your pelvic floor versus the other. So we can start to get some of those clues by looking at the body as a whole, and then we may focus more in on that pelvic floor dysfunction. And with that, we do often do an internal examination with pelvic floor physical therapy. And that is so we can really see what exactly is going on with those pelvic floor muscles. Are they able to contract? Are they able to relax? Do we have areas of tension or tightness throughout? But I always like to say, we like to meet you exactly where you are comfort level-wise. So if someone comes in and they think, oh, I don't feel comfortable with the internal portion, or that's something I'm not ready to do yet, we have so many other tools that we can use to really address and kind of figure out what's going on within your body. So don't let that deter you from physical therapy. Then we'll work on some of that guided pelvic floor training where we get to see how can we make your body function and work the best that it can. We get to use all these very cool tools such as biofeedback. We have little sensors that we can place on the body. We can see what's going on in the muscles in the region. We can have you stand and move and squat and do all different movements and see what's going on with the pelvic floor when you're doing that. We can also use ultrasound. These pictures are actually ultrasound images where we look at the bladder. So we just use an ultrasound here low. And we see, okay, here's the bladder. And then we see when you're doing contractions, what's happening to those internal organs? Are they lifted and supported the way that they should? Or are we seeing dysfunction? Are we seeing contraction one side versus the other? Are we seeing that we're actually bearing down and putting more pressure throughout that pelvic cavity? We can assess and look at that. We do a lot of visual and we do a lot of verbal and feeling feedback so that we can know what's going on in the body. We like people to be able to see what's happening so they can connect that feeling within their body to what's going on and understand that. We work at guided exercise, breath work with pelvic floor incorporation, and we can discuss ways to improve ideal bowel, bladder, and functional habits. So there's a little overview. Okay, the cool thing about pelvic floor physical therapy is that it works. Research shows over and over and over again that pelvic floor physical therapy can be super successful at helping to improve or totally eliminate pelvic floor dysfunction. And one thing that can happen in our society is sometimes people can go to the more extreme route first, maybe going to a surgical intervention or something else prior to trying this more conservative treatment method first. And what we know is often we can kind of avoid surgery if we can go this route, physical therapy first. Or if there's someone that needs a surgery down the road, we know that the more that they understand the pelvic floor, the contraction, the pressure management side of things, if they do have surgery, they're much more likely to have successful outcomes that last much longer if they have this treatment on board prior to surgery or post-surgery. And I have a lot of people ask, like, is it too late for pelvic floor physical therapy? I had kids 30 years ago. Like, is it too late for this? Absolutely not. We can work on this if you are postpartum, newly postpartum. I have a 3-month-old baby, and I am, totally in this realm working on it. But we can work on it 30 years postpartum, or we can work on it if you've had symptoms for 20 years versus they started 2 weeks ago. Doesn't matter. Don't let that limit you. In most studies looking at the effectiveness of pelvic floor physical therapy, there are no reports of adverse effects in guided physical therapy treatment. So how cool is that? How many interventions can we say there are no adverse effects, right? Surgeries, medications, they usually come with a long list of these are some of the things that can happen after that are not great, right? But physical therapy, typically, there's no reports of that in the pelvic health realm. So that's really exciting news and good for us. This is my team here, just so you know. This is a picture of me, and then I have 2 other pelvic health physical therapists that we work with, and 1 physical therapy assistant that we all focus on pelvic health PT. Okay, so the next slide, I wanted to give you a little bit more to take home and for you to work on. And if I haven't made you uncomfortable enough talking about the pelvic floor already, I wanted to just dive a little deeper into it, get you squirming a bit more, wake you up for the last part of this presentation. But I wanted to talk about having bowel movements and easy things that we can do for home to help us all be more successful in this area. So I'm not a teacher, but we're gonna move into pooping 101 today. And with this, first thing, if there's nothing else that you glean from this presentation, I want you to think, okay, maybe there's a few of these things that I can use. We all poop, so this is something that can help us all be successful. So step 1, we want to elevate the knees a little bit higher than the hips. So you may have heard of something called a squatty potty. They have done great marketing, and so that is something that can be super helpful. But you can also use anything at home that you have, like a stool, to elevate those feet just a bit. We want our knees to be a little bit higher. Often, there can be elevated toilet seats these days, right? And those are helpful to get onto, get off of, but they actually really cause a disservice to our pelvic floor. Our body was evolved to really have bowel movements in a squatted a low position. And so if we can elevate the knees, we can kind of mirror or mimic that position. That'll help the pelvic floor relax and lengthen, make it for an easier passage of our stool. We want to relax when we're here. We can do some of those big diaphragmatic breaths that we talked about, or we can imagine softening or melting of that pelvic floor. We want to avoid straining or bearing down. So our goal is to relax, maybe have some gentle pushing, but we don't want that straining, pushing that intra-abdominal pressure force down on that pelvic floor. That can lead to things like prolapse or cause some more dysfunction within that body. We want to limit the time on the toilet. So some of you might be thinking, ooh, I need to talk to my spouse about this, right? They're in there for an hour every morning. But our goal is really to have someone in the restroom 5 to 10 minutes. If things are not moving at that time, get up, move, do some activity, have some coffee, go back in, so that we're not spending long periods of time straining, sitting and straining on that pelvic floor. We want to avoid screens. So in today's smartphone world, if we take our phones in and we're watching these, often we're watching shows, screens, we're having some of the visual stimuli that can actually cause our muscles to kind of contract and tighten without realizing it. So we want to instead allow for a more peaceful space for us to have those bowel movements. Just know that it's normal to have a bowel movement 3 times a day or 3 times a week. So everybody's a little bit different on that scale. But with that said, the caveat is that our bowel movement should be smooth, soft, and formed kind of sausage shape. And so if you are not going very frequently, and then when you are going, you're having hard rocks, pebbles, kind of a hard, bumpy log type of stool, then it means that that body is backed up a little bit. That stool is hanging out in your colon for too long of a period of time. Your body is absorbing a lot of that liquid because it's hanging out there, and it means that we're not having as much regularity as we would like. With that said, a way to help that is hydrate, hydrate, hydrate. A good rule of thumb is whatever you weigh in pounds. If you cut that number in half, that's the minimum amount of ounces that you should be drinking per day. And if you are sweating or exercising, that number needs to increase. But that's just a good general rule of thumb. A lot of people as well really try to limit water intake because they're having some of that bladder leakage. And I just wanted to touch on this. Later in the day, it is fine to limit some of that fluid intake towards bedtime so that it's not waking you up. But if we limit water intake throughout the entire day, what it does is it makes our urine more highly concentrated. And if our urine is more highly concentrated, it really tends to irritate the lining of our bladder, and our body wants to get rid of it. The body's like, this is so irritating here, and we're actually more likely to have leakage. So if we can increase our water intake, we're gonna dilute that urine down just a bit. Our body is gonna be more comfortable holding that within our body, and we're going to possibly help with some of that leakage. Normal voiding for urine is every 2 to 4 hours. So if you're going more frequently than that, there may be something that we could work on for pelvic health physical therapy. So just going off this, you can find your success story. One kind of funny story, a couple years ago, I had worked with someone who had chronic constipation, and I was having difficulty emptying his bowels, going very infrequently. He was post-prostate surgery, but ran into him in the grocery store. And I find often that when I first meet people, it's maybe a little bit challenging sometimes to make people feel comfortable talking about their pelvic floor function. And maybe by the end of treatment, people are very comfortable talking about it, right? So I was at the grocery store in line. So he ran over. There's a big line of people, but he said, Sammy, I am pooping every day, and they are these beautiful sausage poops. And I had to giggle, and people kind of giggled in line. But I just thought it was so wonderful that we broke down some of those barriers, those walls of talking about pelvic floor, and we normalized, hey, everybody has a pelvic floor. Everybody needs to work on this function. Okay, I wanted to put a little plug in here. So I'm over at CPR, and you may think, oh, she's just plugging her clinic. But I feel like this is really important for the community to know. So we offer free 15-minute screens where you can come in, you can talk one-on-one with a therapist, whether it's about pelvic floor physical therapy or any other region of the body. We treat, from head, neck, all the way to foot, ankle, toes, whatever it is. And sometimes people just don't know, like, is physical therapy really what I need? Am I a good candidate for physical therapy? So you can always call our office, come in for that free screen. Our office will help you understand, like, yes, this is a great place for you to be. Physical therapy can help, or we can help you find the correct provider if you need something that is beyond physical therapy. And sometimes with the pelvic health world, people really like to meet the therapist one-on-one and see, okay, who would I be working with? Do I feel comfortable? Is this where I need to be? Could this even be helpful for me? So I just want to throw that out there. We have 2 locations in Twin Falls. One is in the Renaissance office. One is the Red Barn on Addison. You may see that. And then we have a Buell office as well. So feel free to call if you have questions to talk to one of us. Well, thank you so much for bearing with me through pelvic floor. You guys were a wonderful audience. And I hope that by having this discussion, you feel a bit more comfortable to talk to your friends, talk to your family, maybe help our community as a whole become healthier with this portion of pelvic floor health. So thank you so much.
Wasn't Sammy just fantastic? Great information for all of us. Thank you so much for your time and energy and for being here. Again, if you have questions specifically for Sammy, she'll be out in the lobby. I also wanted to remind you that we do have some food out there. However, try not to bring it back into the auditorium. It will be out in the lobby if you need to have a little pick-me-up, a little bit of a snack before our next presentation, who will be Sarah Rinaldi. We'll see you back here in 5 to 6 minutes. Thank you.
Testing, testing. Thank you.
Can you guys, oh, there we
there
go.
we are.
Hi,
Okay.
hey,
Okay,
welcome
you're gonna have to hold that
back.
up in the sky.
All right, so
can't
time
see.
for our second drawing.
Okay, hold it up so I can't see in there.
Oh,
There you
she said to hold it up. She's pretty tall though. I'm really short.
Oh, they're falling out the bottom.
I'll get these.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, so the winner is
Debbie Snavely. Debbie Snavely. It's probably eating. We should have told them if they weren't in here, they'd miss out and we'd draw someone else, huh? Okay. All right, we're going to draw someone else. Okay, Laura Peterson. Laura Peterson. Ooh, she's at the snack table too? Holy Hannah. All right. Renee Ponton. All right, Renee. Good job. Way to be here, girl.
Third time is it. Congratulations. All right, everybody, welcome back. I would like to introduce our next presenter. This is Sarah Rinaldi. Please give Sarah a round of applause. Sarah grew up in a small town in North Idaho called Bonners Ferry. She attended the University of Idaho. Go Vandals! Yeah, where she obtained her bachelor's and master's degrees in human nutrition and dietetics. She has been a registered and licensed dietitian for over 20 years, has worked in various fields of nutrition, including as a clinical public health, long-term care, and wellness dietitian. She has been teaching full-time here at CSI in the Health Professions Department since 2018. Already? Wow. Her favorite part of teaching is getting to know her students and teaching them the science of nutrition. In her free time, she enjoys spending time outdoors and in the kitchen, go figure, with her family. So here's Sarah Rinaldi.
Thank you. All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. I feel like I'm glad I went third because I got to hear Monique talking about metabolism. And I also love metabolism. I tell my students that's the scariest chapter of our nutrition textbook, but it's my favorite because I'm kind of a nerd like that. And then Sammy's talking about poop and staying well hydrated. So that's right in my wheelhouse. So there's quite a bit of crossover that will come into play with Monique's presentation and Sammy's presentation. So I was asked to come and talk about nutrition, and nutrition is a big, wide open topic, right? I tell my students all the time, I'll mention something as a little side note, and I say, we could have somebody come and talk about this. We could probably make a whole class, a whole semester just about this one nutrition topic. So I chose today to focus in on the topic of nutrient density. And some of you might be familiar with the topic of nutrient density. This might be a new concept for some of you, but surely once I start talking about what is nutrient density and why do we care, this will probably resonate with a lot of you. So in my class, we talk a lot about nutrition. We have 16 chapters we cover over the semester. Chapter 18, which is the last chapter of the semester, right before finals, we are finishing up our unit on life cycle nutrition. So we start out talking about nutrition in general. We move into the science of nutrition and how to evaluate your nutrition sources. So how to look for red flags in nutrition. How to tell if something you're looking at about nutrition is evidence-based, because you all know, especially now with social media, the internet, TV, and everything being streamed immediately, there is so much information out there about nutrition, right? Has anybody ever read like 2 conflicting articles and been confused? Has anybody ever been confused? Yes. Okay, so I teach my students to really critically evaluate where the information is coming from, who's sponsoring it. We move into talking about the macronutrients, carbohydrates, fats, proteins. Then we talk about metabolism, vitamins and minerals, the micronutrients, and then life cycle nutrition. So the last chapter is nutrition for older adults. So there is an entire chapter about this. And so some of the information that I'm sharing with you today comes from the textbook, comes from the presentation I give to my students. First, I wanted to talk about kind of my soapbox. This is kind of what I feel like whenever I'm talking about food philosophy, okay? Why do we care about nutrition, and kind of my slant on it? We're then going to be talking about some of the nutrients of concern. So for the aging population, should we call it the wise? The wise, you know, we get wiser as we age. There are certain nutrients that we really want to focus on, and I feel like Monique, Dr. Middlecoff talked a lot about those too. What foods we really want to focus on, and how do we get these nutrient-dense foods in our diet. And then, because I thought you guys might be tired of hearing people talk to you, by this point in the day, I'm going to do a little food demonstration with 3 very nutrient-dense recipes you could have for breakfast, lunch, or dinner, okay? I'd also talk with my hands because I'm Italian, so I hope I don't rip this microphone off myself. Okay, so probably you've heard of this quote before. This is from Hippocrates, which is known as the founder of modern medicine. I was actually looking this up a little bit more, and it turns out there's actually no evidence of him actually saying this in any of his writings, which I thought was interesting. But I think the whole point of this is that Hippocrates recognized that what we eat has a direct effect on our health and our body, right? I tell my students a lot, I know it sounds corny, and I know your parents probably used to tell you this, but food you eat is like fuel in a car, right? It really is, and it sounds cliche, but it's true. And like Dr. Middlecoff was saying, thinking of food as not necessarily medicine, because you know medicine is medicine. A lot of you might take medicine for certain conditions, and medicine is definitely has a place, right? We need medicine sometimes. But if we can talk about eating good food, eating adequate, nutrient-dense foods, it really can have an effect on how we age and our overall health. I also have allergies, and Claritin makes my mouth so dry, so I don't have coughing fits, but I might need to drink water. Okay, I also found this little quote, and I don't know who this woman is. She's a writer, but I thought this was a nice quote. Eating healthy food fills your body with energy and nutrients. Imagine your cells smiling back at you and saying thank you. So my soapbox, food philosophy, I feel like in this day and age, you know, with all this access to nutrition information, a lot of the times I feel that we are bombarded with the negative when it comes to food, right? Especially women, but of course some men fall into these pressures as well, where